Thank you, Edwin. Thank you for everyone for coming. My understanding is we're supposed to end at 7:30, and it's already past 7:30. So, there are a couple of things I wanted to do. First of all, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the genesis of this project and how it started. And it was one of those things where, growing up in the Philippines, of course, you grew up reading Joaquin, and you hear all about him. And not really appreciating just how important a writer he is because of the fact, just the way literary culture and literary politics works in the Philippines. It always tends to be sort of marginalized. It's kind of like an afterthought, as it is in many other places, right? And so when one of the things that happened was that I just finished writing a piece on comparing Nick Joaquin with Renato Constantino. Those of you who remember Renato Constantino, he has that very famous piece, The Miseducation of the Filipino, where he totally scapegoats English and he blames everything on English, right? The reason why things are in such hellish state and have always been so hellish in the Philippines is because the Americans imposed English and therefore cut the Filipinos off from their real, authentic self, right? And he does this all in impeccable English, right? So I thought, this is really strange. Renato Constantino is a very smart man, and yet he seems absolutely incapable of realizing the irony of his situation and the dilemma the dilemma, or rather that the problem he derides and denounces is actually one that he also actively inhabits. And then you look at Joaquin, and Joaquin has a completely different take on English, right? And his take on English in many ways is sort of characteristic of his generation. It's like the second generation of writers who grew up writing in English. He was younger than Jose Garcia. He's a few years younger than Jose Garcia, but very much shaped by the sort of aesthetic choices and the kind of linguistic politics that Villa and his generation made. So what were these aesthetic choices and linguistic politics? So first of all, if you read, there's this terrific collection of Jose Garcia Villa's critical, it's called The Critical Villa, and it's edited by Jonathan Chua, available from Ateneo University Press. And it's all about Villa's sort of aesthetic theories, his attempts to evaluate Philippine writing. And it's very clear that for Villa and his generation, literature is only possible in English. That the vernacular is not suited to anything close to English. It's too oral, therefore it can never be reduced to a kind of modernist project. And as far as they were concerned, if you wanted to write serious literature, you could only do so in English. And Nick Joaquin has a very interesting small essay published in Philippine Quarterly Review, which comes out of Cebu, called The Filipino Fictionist in English, where he basically echoes the same thing. And he says, if you want to be a serious literateur, you've got to write in English. The vernaculars won't get you anywhere. And so there's always been this sort of prejudice against the vernacular among his generation. And of course, that came out of the colonial public school systems, where English was imposed as a medium of instruction. But in order to learn English, students had to repress the vernacular. So those of you who remember this, who grew up in the Philippines, at least I do until the 60s, if you were caught speaking the vernacular, you were fined, right? 25 cents or something like that, right? And this is a practice, of course, that started under the American colonial period. So there was a cost to speaking the vernacular in the school. At the same time that Spanish, of course, was marginalized, right? Especially after World War II. There's a very simple reason for this, was because far from continuing as a revolutionary language that could possibly offer resources of resistance to the Anglophone hegemony that the Americans had imposed, much of Spain, or rather much of the Spanish and Hispanophile community in the 1930s sided with the Franquistas, against the Republicans, right? They sided with the fascists. And so now Spanish was associated with things that were fascistic, that were backward, with the church. And no self-respecting Filipino who claimed to be modern would be caught speaking in Spanish, right? So there's this huge lobotomy, this huge separation that someone had mentioned about Joaquin, separating Filipino writers, not only from the vernacular, but also separating them from English. I mean, separating them from Spanish, the Spanish of their forefathers. Then there's a third complication. And the third complication has to do with the fact that the English that was being written by the Filipinos were not the kind of English that was being respected, much less validated and recognized by American publishers and American writers. It's very interesting that as much as Filipinos tried to insert themselves, and here we see this, again, the figure of Villa is very interesting here, as much as they tried to insert themselves into metropolitan circuits, metropolitan literary circuits, they were constantly turned down. Right? They were constantly seen as not good enough. There's this very interesting story that Rusil Mojares tells in this fantastic book called Origins of the Filipino Novel. Typical of the situation, I think it was Amando de Guillo, a novelist, who wrote a novel and was picked up by a reviewer in San Francisco, who said, among other things, that the San Francisco directory was far more interesting than anything in this novel. But what was interesting was the reaction of de Guillo. He was so depressed, he was ready to kill himself, which was which is an indication of just how dependent Filipino writers in English were on American critics and American evaluations. And what happened was American critics basically said, no, it's not good enough. It's never going to be good enough. We're not really interested in yourself. And even Villa had a very limited run. He had a small circle of New York folks who liked him, but beyond that, Carlos Bulosan had a very limited run. It wasn't until 1970s with the emergence of Asian American programs that Bulosan came back into circulation, right? The last complication that helps to understand why Joaquin is the way he is and why he is largely unknown in the United States is that on the part of the Americans, among all the colonizing powers, American writers have never written anything of any significance about the Philippines. There are no Kiplings, there are no Orwells, there are no Forsters, right? There are no Conrads, right, that have written about the Philippines. Ben Anderson, one of my professors, used to always say, Americans, unlike the British or the French or the Dutch, were complete Philistines. Complete Philistines. You know, Edward Hemingway comes through the Philippines completely bored, completely uninterested. You know, Faulkner, after receiving his Nobel, visits UP, leaves absolutely no impression, right? In other words, you have the situation where, for the most part, there is no significant American writing on the Philippines. I mean, there's lots of American writing, but they're usually like pretty trashy, right? Second rate. There's no writing of importance. So what you have is a situation where Filipino writers in English, unrecognized in the metropole, right? So they end up writing for themselves, right? Independence comes along, and they end up, as I said, just writing for themselves. And despite the resistance to the vernacular, despite the tendency to sort of denigrate the vernacular, they end up themselves being vernacularized. So English, in effect, becomes another vernacular language, rather than a metropolitan language that allows them to plug themselves into the world republic of letters. Filipino writing in English in the Philippines ends up largely staying in the Philippines. It never gets abroad. We're not like the Indians. We have no Salman Rushdie, right? We're not like the Latin Americans, who are translated into English and all of a sudden have this amazing sort of circulation. And so that situation was one of the situations that bothered me. And I think it bothered a lot of people. And I've always sort of thought, how can we change this situation? How can we take this very rich body of Philippine Anglophone writing steeped in a particular historical moment, right? Informed by particular kinds of aesthetic and political priorities, how can we take this body of writing and circulate it, make it better known, not just to Americans, not just the large world, but to the Filipino diaspora. Because I was very concerned about the fact that the Filipino diaspora itself was being robbed, right, of its proper legacy. And that was what I was concerned with. I guess that's the pedagogue in me, right? That I wanted this to be a moment that was teachable in the sense that people could read it and could learn something from it. And so it was, as most good things happen by accident, right? That I had been thinking about this, and then I happened to mention this to Karina Velasco at Anvil, and Karina then decided, well, you should meet the Joaquin family. And so I met Charo Joaquin, who's in charge of the estate, and we talked about this. And it just so happened that Nick Joaquin's centennial was coming up then. This was 2015, was coming up then. And so I said, well, we should put together a reader. And we should have 3 volumes. Originally, I thought 3 volumes. 1 fiction, 1 history, and then the third would be his reportage, which is fantastic, because as you know, those of you familiar with Nick Joaquin's reportage, he was, doing a sort of this kind of gonzo journalism long before Hunter Thompson was doing it. I mean, he basically invented it in the Philippines. And so I thought that would be great, but then it was too ambitious. And then it would simply sort of reiterate the sort of provincializing tendency of Philippine publishing, which is Philippine books get published by Philippine publishers and get read by a very small number of Filipinos, right? And so we're stuck in the same situation. And it was later on when I was in New York, I was going to give a talk somewhere. We were having dinner in an apartment of Nefertiti Tallar, some of you probably know her, with Gina Apostol and Sheila Coronel. And we were talking about the situation. I said, hey, let's try and get it in the US. Where would it be? Well, there's Penguin, because Penguin had just come out with Villa. They came out with the 2 results. And I happened to sort of have heard of Elda Rotor, who was then the VP of Penguin, but I didn't know her. And Gina said, well, I know her. I'll call her. So she called her that night. The next morning, she said, oh, she said, that's a great idea. Let's pitch the idea to her. Write a proposal. And so I wrote a proposal. And Elda got back and said, yeah, we'll do it, but you have to write the introduction. I said, what? Because I didn't feel like I owned Joaquin. I didn't feel like I had any claim on him. So I felt very resistant to writing the introduction. But then she said, basically, if you're not going to write the introduction, we're not going to do it. So I said, okay, so I'll write the introduction. And when I started to think about it, I thought, my God, what am I going to say? Right? Because the problem, again, is I think the same problem that confronts many people who write about Philippine literature in the United States, which is how do you make this literature, which is well known to you, which is well known to Filipinos, how do you introduce it to people who've never heard of Joaquin, right? How do you convince them that Joaquin properly belongs to what I think of as the World Republic of Letters? That was a big challenge, right? And so you'll see from the introduction, one of the ways I got around that was, number one, to call attention to the problem of English, to situate that problem historically, to see how it comes out of a whole set of complex historical conditions that resonate with many other places where English has been used. Second was to focus on Joaquin as a storyteller, and the question of the storyteller, which is a recurring problem in literary theory. What does it mean to tell a story? What is the status of a storyteller? What makes a story different from a novel? What makes it different from a poem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I ended up writing. Now, if we had more time, I would have wanted to read one of my favorite passages, but I don't think we have time. So maybe. Oh, okay. This is. It's actually one sentence. One of my favorite sentences. One of my favorite sentences. This occurs in the discussion in the introduction where I talk about one of the things that's central to the project of storytelling is relating historical experience, right? Not history, but historical experience. How people experience the sense of the past vanishing and yet returning to haunt them. Because I think that's what happens with Joaquin. It's not just that the past disappears, but the past returns in all kinds of mysterious, haunting ways, and how to deal with that. What I said, let me just read this passage and then a short commentary that goes with it. So this is the way I set it up. Joaquin often resorted to long, sinuous sentences that meandered like the Pasig River, the major waterway that links and divides Manila, overflowing into the many esteros of popular forgetfulness. Here, for example, is the opening sentence to Doña Jeronima. As I said, this is one of my favorite sentences. Okay, it goes like this. In the days of the galleons, a certain Archbishop of Manila was called to a council in Mexico, but on the way there fell in with pirates who seized his ship, looted the holds, slew the crew, and were stringing up the Archbishop to a mast, when a sudden storm ripped up and wrecked both pirate craft and Philippine galleon, drowning all that were on board, save only the Archbishop, who, being bound to the cross of the mast, was borne safely over the wrath of the waters and thus reached the shores of a desert isle, a dry isle that was but a tip of a reef in the sea, where for a burning year he lived on fish and prayer, on rainwater and meditation, crouched day and night in deep thought at the foot of the cross of the mast he had set up on the shore. all alone in that waste of ocean, until a passive ship, mystified by the reflection as of a giant cross shining in the air, tracked the mirage to the horizon and came upon the desert isle, and upon the cross of mast planted on the shore, and upon the bowed, mute, shriveled old man squatting motionless and cross-legged there, stark naked and half blind and burned black as coal, all his hair turned white and his white beard trailing down to his navel, and hardly able to stand or move or speak or grasp, in which dismal condition he was carried back to his city, arriving there some 2 years after he had left in glory, having departed a fine blaze of a man, handsome and vigorous, and bidden farewell by all the city to a tumult of bells, banners, fireworks, and music, and returning now in decay, terribly altered, terribly aged, mere skin and bone and wild eye, but still amid bells, banners, fireworks, music, in the tumult of the city, for news of this rescue had preceded him. The marvel of his sojourn on the island had grown into a legend in the retelling, and he himself had become such a figure of miracle, the man twice saved by the sign of the cross, and fed on the desert isle, 'twas said, by ravens like Elijah, and with manna from heaven like the Israelites, that the folk who poured forth to welcome him dropped to their knees with a shudder as he was borne past, a frail wraith that however had power to stun the eye and seize the soul, that would indeed in those days possess the popular mind, every traveling bard having but this one ballad to sing, and no print hawked at fairs but carried the archbishop's picture, and a relation of his adventures, by which diverse manners the fame of him spread as a holy man, on whom God had showered such mystical favors, that when the archbishop at last emerged from a long convalescence, firmer in fabric, but never again to be in his prime, it was to find himself being revered in the land as a saint.
That's one sentence.
That's one sentence. There are, guess what? Lots of those kinds of sentences. Which is why you got to buy the book, man. You got to buy it. This is about the, which is why people are sort of drawn to compare to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and various other people, right? And you can see how the way I put it in this passage, certainty is carried away by the irresistible torrents of chance, as space falls into the vortex of time, right? And so this is part of what Joaquin is trying to do. He's trying to sort of shock you into recognizing how the past is never over, how the past is always running like a dog nipping at the heels of the present, right? And how the past, as it were, is before you in both senses of that word. That is, it comes before you, and yet it confronts you as you think you're moving forward. Here comes the past, right? Returning to haunt you. And I think sentences like this in many other passages in Joaquin, the woman with two navels is another perfect example of that, right? The two navels being two moments in the past, undecidability, double language, double identity, double consciousness, all of that being played out by Joaquin, right? So you can begin to see that when you think of Joaquin in these terms, the comparative possibilities are inexhaustible, right? You can begin to think of Du Bois. You can begin to think of Marquez. You can begin to think of Rushdie. You can begin to think of a whole range of post-colonial authors, right? And most recently, Viet Nguyen, right? Who wrote The Stranger. So I mean, there's all kinds. And so I'm hoping that with this Penguin edition, this is what happens. Not only will Joaquin be celebrated as this singular Filipino author, you know, sort of a treasure in this rich heritage of Filipino culture, blah, 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 but that Joaquin will also be available for comparative sort of clarity, right? That people will read Joaquin the way they read Virginia Woolf, not because she represents the epitome of English culture, but because she writes about the world in a particular way that stirs thought and that moves the spirit and that stirs the emotion and the sentiment, right? Just like so-and-so, just like so-and-so, right? So in that way, as I said, let me reiterate, and I'll close with these, in that way, Joaquin can, as it were, take his place in the world republic of letters, you know, with all the other important authors, right? Not simply as a Filipino, but just as important as a writer of consequence. So let me stop there.